Hello everyone and welcome back to our series on painting A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures in real time. Today we're going to be finishing up the bases, first by applying some acrylic paint to match up all that texture gel with the rest of the base, then by putting a brown ink wash over top to just pull out some more of the detail and darken down the color a little bit so it looks a little more soily, and finally, flocking. This is actually going to be a really short episode despite being composed of multiple different sessions mashed into one. Because each of the sessions was about 5 minutes. None of the jobs we're doing here are particularly complicated, but that being said, there are some ways to do basing that can take way more time. This is just a really quick and dirty approach I use, just like everything else I'm showing here, to get a reasonable looking base out in a decent amount of time. Basing in and of itself can be really intimidating. I personally just didn't even touch it for the longest time. A lot of my older miniatures just don't have any basing done whatsoever. That being said, one thing I have found, especially by keeping the base dark, is we can keep working with that effect of sort of pulling the eyes toward the face of the miniature, and it really helps make all of the colors on the miniature pop out. Just having a really blank base, especially when I prime in a light color, which makes the bases tend to be pretty light, means the miniature's colors don't really show as well as they could. A little bit of work on the basing can also make your miniatures just look way more finished. It's pretty incredible, really. A miniature that's on a base that's just black is totally functional, but a miniature that's on a base, if you look at some of the guys who use a little bit of cork and other materials, that can really look incredible. Even just this couple-step basing process that we're going to be using here of putting on some texture gel, painting it down, making it match up with everything else, does a lot for the look of the miniature. This first step that we're doing right now is really simple. Just the acrylic paint, just like we were doing before. I'm applying it really thick and dabbing it on with a cheap brush. The texture gel makes it really hard to get the paint inside it. That's actually one of the reasons why I put down some of this cork brown before I went about putting the texture gel on this time. In the past, I've waited until afterwards to paint the whole base. What I found was that it was meaning that areas under the texture gel were not getting hit with the paint, because the paint has a really hard time penetrating. Now I can thin out the paint, and that'll make it flow into the gaps between the texture beads a little better, or alternately, we can just hope that the ink gets in the gaps. And generally speaking, it wasn't super noticeable, but I just figured I'd change my workflow up for this one, and it seems to have worked out well. The black of the texture gel is a lot less egregious than the really bright white of the base underneath, in terms of something that you could miss while painting this stuff, so it's pretty reasonable to be leaving that, if anything. As with anything else I use these Vallejo paints for, you can obviously use the cheap acrylics, the craft acrylics that I use for a lot of other stuff in these videos. The only reason I use the Vallejos is they are a little pre-thinned, and they can be closer to the color I want immediately right off the bat. That is the convenience that a lot of people go for when they buy commercial model paints. A lot of people have huge collections, and they have a shade for every situation, and to be honest, you get a really good effect that way because you know you're having a pre-mixed, pre-pigmented paint. And especially with stuff like Vallejo, or if you're looking at like testers for vehicles, or Citadel paints in particular, they're a really premium mix. They tend to have a good ratio of medium to pigment. There's no messing around you have to do in order to get the same color every time, and there's no messing around you have to do if you've got multiple ones in different values to shade an area with a paint that is the same color. That being said, that advantage doesn't outweigh the fact that they're pretty expensive, especially for just small amounts, for my taste anyway. So I tend to just use the straight craft acrylic in almost every situation. I just bought a big box of, I think it was the medieval colors of Vallejo off of Amazon at one point, when I was trying to look into sort of professional paints, trying them out more. So I still use those because I still have them. I might buy the same box eventually, but to be honest, 90% of the box hasn't even been touched yet. The only colors I really use are the metals and that brown. What we're moving on to now is that ink wash for the base. That's just pure, undiluted, untouched brown ink from our box. It's a pretty warm brown, which is pretty nice for this. There are some inks. I've actually got another ink on my desk that's a darker brown. It also has a pretty good effect on the bases, but this warm, sort of normal chocolatey brown works pretty well. It doesn't make it look particularly like actual soil, I wouldn't say. Just like our beads don't look like actual sand. But the overall effect is pretty good. It's brown and it contrasts well with the flock when we put it on top. For this, notice that I'm using a much bigger brush. We're really just trying to slather it on, and having a big brush whose bristles can pull in a whole lot of the ink is going to help you put on a really thick layer. Having it sit sort of unevenly and pool and all those things that we don't normally want it to do on our miniature, so we use the flow improver to help prevent, or else we just apply small amounts of it to help prevent it. All those sorts of effects will just make it look more natural and modeled at this point. So really, just lay it on there, go for it. Put it on thick and let it get thin in some places, thick in others, pool here, not there, that kind of stuff. I'm just dabbing it on with the brush and making sure I really charge my brush by tapping it down into the paint. Again, this isn't one of my best brushes because, as you can see, that's not going to be good for keeping bristles the best of shape, as it were. That being said, again, with my brush conditioner soap stuff that I bought from Michael's, my brushes stay in really good shape almost across the board. There's a few stray bristles on a few of them that I use almost exclusively for dry brushing. But aside from that, they're pretty good. I'm also putting a little bit of brown on the flag there. I just wanted to make the flag look a little dirty. You know, it's been knocked down and now he's trampling over the Lannister's front line or whatever he's doing, so made sense to get a little bit of brown on there, I figured. While you're doing this, speaking of getting a little bit of brown on to dirty things up, you can take a little bit of solace in the fact that this is going to be one of the easiest parts of the entire painting process. Even if you mess up, like unless you drag the paintbrush over his face while you're picking up a miniature, it's all just going to look like dirt. All the parts that are closest to the ground are probably the parts that are going to get dirty, right? Let's be honest. So if you just splash a little bit of brown ink up, so be it. The same goes for a texture gel from the earlier stages. Something just painted as a clod of mud. There may be miniatures where you really don't want this to happen, but you'll have to take that into your own design. In this case, all these miniatures, they seem pretty, fighting trim, as it were. Brienne, maybe I've been trying to keep that blue really pure. I would have been a little more worried about getting dirt on it, but it's not like spilling red onto an area that's supposed to be white or something really jarring. It should just blend in with the rest of the design of the miniature if you're in a rush and you don't feel like fixing it. If you do feel like fixing it, though, it's just an ink spill. It's the same thing as we've been doing this whole time. Get a dry brush, wick it away, it'll almost all go away. If you need to cover up anything after that, well, you can get the same ink and lay it on over top. The airbrush flow improver will also help thin it out a little bit and help blend in any stains that you may make. We've seen some examples of that in previous episodes, so if you haven't seen those yet, jump on back and take a look. Of course, if you're looking for examples of someone correcting mistakes, stick around. You'll get plenty of those. Now here we're going to be getting into the actual flocking of the miniatures. My tools for this are this Mod Podge matte glue. It's a little more than a glue. It also acts as a sealer. It does all sorts of stuff. It's really nice. And we're actually going to see, speaking of corrections, we're going to see a bit of a different use for it, I think, next episode, in terms of taking advantage of that matte property. The other thing is this Woodland Scenic Static Grass Flock. Now, I've seen all sorts of tutorials about making flock yourself. I personally don't. Price-wise versus effort, I get a really good product from just buying it. Here's a little blooper for you. I'm going to try and demonstrate the Mod Podge on camera while picking it up and being utterly not aware of my hands and the angle things are going to sit at, so enjoy that. The reason I just laid out the lid of the flocking on the desk in front of me like that is I'm actually going to be using it as a bit of a receptacle to try and catch some of the flock while I work. Let's just fade away from that. There you go. So yeah, I'm going to be using the lid of the flocking to catch the flock that is dropping off of the miniatures. As best I can anyway. You'll see in future series and future episodes, I'm probably going to use bigger containers or different containers. I'm still experimenting. The gist of it is you want something to catch all the flock, because not all of the flock is going to stick in the glue. In fact, if you don't catch it, there will be a surprising amount of spillage, which might not be a huge issue if you make your own and you make massive batches of like kilos of flock or something, but yeah, I paid for the product. I'm going to take care of it, and I'm going to try and get as much as I can out of it. So here I'm going to be using that small, sort of wide bristled brush to grab some Mod Podge on it, and just dab it on in random areas around the base. Obviously, if you want the whole base to be flocked, you can just put it on everywhere. If you just want like one area to be flocked, you can just put it on one spot. Be creative. There are also static grass tufts that you can buy. I have some of those. I haven't really used them. They look kind of weird to me, like they're bushes. They're a very specific kind of bush. They do look like a bush I've seen in real life, but that's all they look like, so I don't use them much. The big thing I'd like to point out here is while I'm flocking, the way I do it is I grab a whole tuft of the flock in between my fingers and pinch it really hard. This sort of makes all of the strands start to follow a single line, and then when I dab them on, they dab on in such a way that some of the strands are going to be standing on end, with just one end having been stuck into the glue. Static grass is actually made for being applied with a fancy applicator that sort of uses static electricity, as the name implies, to make sure that all of the strands are pointing in one direction. There's some really good examples of this in action on YouTube. I don't know how effective it would be on miniature bases per se, but especially for railroad setups and that kind of stuff. Look up Luke Towan. I'll write it on screen here so that you can see how it's spelled on YouTube. He is fantastic. He makes these great dioramas. And if you're looking for terrain ideas or even just little basing ideas, you might have some good inspiration if you look there. In any case, I don't have a static grass applicator because I guess I haven't been handy enough so far to make my own, as some people seem to, and I haven't bothered buying one. That being said, just pinching it like this and making sure that a decent number of the strands are pointing in the right direction as you dab it onto the base seems to do a really good job of just making sure that some of it's standing up, some of it's on its side. It looks like it's been a little bit trampled, but the grass isn't just lying flat and wilted. That's the one thing you're going to want to avoid. I find previously I used to just sprinkle the flock over the miniatures, but doing so really did mean that most of the flock looked flat already and kind of just sad. So by dabbing it on, you can make sure it gets a little pointed upwards. While you're doing this, you're going to want to make sure that you get as little as possible, if not no, Mod Podge onto the miniature itself. The Mod Podge is going to mean that the flock sticks to the miniature, obviously, and the flock's going to stick to the miniature anyway because it's got a bit of a slick surface from all that ink, and the flock is made to react to static electricity anyway, so it's just going to be clinging to stuff. But Mod Podge is not going to help that, and it's going to be kind of smudgy, and it's going to be a bit of a pain to get off without potentially smudging the ink underneath. So try to avoid it as much as possible. But again, it's largely fixable if you just kind of wipe at it with a dry brush, as we've been doing for other mistakes. Or happy little accidents, as a certain painter would say. As we come onto the Blackfish's base, we've got a bit of a special challenge with this guy. He's got a whole lot of space. Here we can kind of see the general rule that I use when I'm applying my flock, and that is just to avoid the textured areas overall. The textured area sticking out in the middle kind of just looks good, and the flock does a pretty good job of sitting in the crevasses between it and highlighting a bit of a, different bands of color and making the base look detailed as we go. That being said, a big base like this would be a great opportunity for any extra details you want to throw on. I don't know if you've got like one of those big boxes of Games Workshop skulls, or if you've just got this game and you've just got whatever's hanging around your house, look for pieces of corkboard. They've got a cool texture and they can kind of look like sedimentary rock or sand from a fish tank or anything you might want to put on to just add some flair to the base. You've been given all this space by the sculptor, you may as well use it. As you shake off all the excess flock and start to get ready to put down your miniature, you're probably going to realize that a whole bunch is getting stuck to the miniature. Like I talked about before, the surface is kind of tacky because we've been using ink. So if you look at the hindquarters of the Blackfish's horse, it's clearly been having a little bit of a play earlier, rolling around trying to get some flies off. Your best bet with that is just to use a big, dry brush. In this case, I'm using the brush we were using earlier for applying ink. By now, it's obviously dried off. And I'm just using it to sweep all of the flock off, just lightly brush the surface. You don't want something that's wet by any means, because that's going to affect the ink. And you don't want something that's got harsh bristles either. This one has really soft bristles, but stiff bristles are probably going to scratch up the surface as well. Just keep that in mind while you're doing this. That being said, it's good to give all of your miniatures a little brush after you've given them some flock, because they're definitely going to have something stuck to the hem of their capes or their pants or their boots or something. And once that's varnished on, it's going to be much harder to get off. In fact, it's probably going to look kind of awful. Anyway, I'd just like to thank you all for watching now. Today we went over the process of finishing up our bases. Next episode we're going to be varnishing, and it's going to be off to the finish line with these miniatures. Thank you all for sticking with this, and I hope you've learned something or at least found it interesting. Until next time, go play some games.